What would you do if you woke up one day to find your entire city engulfed in the horror of a plague? Imagine the once bustling streets now echo only with the sound of funeral bells, wooden carts piled high with corpses roll through every alley, and even the breath of the person standing next to you becomes a deadly threat. That was 14th century Europe, a time when the Black Death plague spread terrifying fear to millions of people. In that context, an image so haunting that it became a symbol of death emerged. The plague doctors with their long black cloaks, wooden staffs in hand, and especially their fearsome bird beak masks. With bulging round spectacles and a long beak stuffed with herbs, they walked through the streets like ghosts. The people believed they held medical knowledge that they were the last barrier between life and death. But did they truly save anyone? Or were they themselves just victims of their own helplessness against the epidemic? Today we will turn back those blood-soaked pages of history together to understand why the bird beak mask was created, what bizarre healing methods were applied, and how the image of the ghostly doctor became such a terrifying and obsessive symbol for humanity. To understand why the plague doctors with their strange attire came into being, we need to return to 14th century Europe, the era when the Black Death swept across the continent. In just a few years, from 1347 to 1351, the plague killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, about one-third of Europe's population at the time. Death came so swiftly that many villages were wiped out in a matter of weeks with no one left to bury their loved ones. At that time, medical knowledge was extremely limited. People had no concept of the Yersinia pestis bacterium or its transmission through fleas and rats. Instead, physicians believed the plague originated from miasma, a toxic vapor in the air, from the wrath of the gods, or even from the alignment of the stars. Because of this belief, the prevention and treatment of the plague were heavily colored by religion, superstition, and desperation. Daily life was completely upended. Bustling cities suddenly became giant cemeteries. People lived in such fear that they avoided even their own relatives for fear of infection. Priests and monks, who were usually seen as spiritual pillars, also fell in large numbers, causing religious faith to be violently shaken. Meanwhile, the ruling class was bewildered, issuing decrees to ban gatherings and close markets, but everything proved futile against the speed of the disease's spread. It was in this tragic landscape that a special class of people emerged, those who took it upon themselves to confront the epidemic, the plague doctors. They were hired by cities and authorities to care for the sick, record mortality rates, and sometimes simply to be present so that the public felt that someone was doing something. And to fulfill this role, they donned their peculiar costume, which would later become one of the most frightening symbols in human history. Imagine a morning in 14th century Europe. Before the sun could dispel the early mist, the entire city was already echoing with the sound of rolling wooden carts laden with corpses covered in filthy rags. The sounds of mourning mixed with church bells to create an endless funeral dirge. And in that hellish scene, figures in black cloaks, holding wooden staffs, their faces hidden by long-beaked masks, could be seen. They were the plague doctors, the living symbols of death. Their masks made anyone who saw them shudder. The two round glass eye holes reflected a pale light like the eyes of a dead bird, while the long beak pointed forward as if to swallow any faint glimmer of hope. Inside that beak, they stuffed herbs, lavender, mint, cloves, and even opium. They believed that these strong scents would filter the miasmatic air that was seeping all around. But in the end, it was just a desperate attempt to cover the overwhelmingly suffocating stench of death. The doctor's entire body was covered in a heavy black leather or waxed fabric gown like a mobile coffin. Wearing gloves and boots, they walked slowly, their steps making a dry rustling sound amidst the deadly streets. And with them always was the wooden staff. With this staff, they pointed to infected houses, turned over convulsing patients without touching them, or simply pushed back the panicked crowds who rushed to them begging for help. However, the harsh truth is that most plague doctors could not cure anything. Many had no medical training at all. They were just individuals hired for the main task of recording the number of cases and deaths. They would go to a patient's house, write a will for the dying, and then quietly leave. People whispered to each other, "When the plague doctor knocks on your door, it means death is already standing right behind you." The treatments they applied were both strange and gruesome. In some places, doctors would lance the swollen, pus-filled buboes to let the bad blood out. In others, they would burn fires to fumigate rooms or mix medicines with mercury and turpentine, forcing patients to swallow them like a panacea. Some even believed that smelling human feces or bathing in wine would help cleanse the body. Behind every remedy was an obsession. They were all just rotten life rafts that people clung to in desperation. Many plague doctors eventually became victims themselves. Their ghostly outfits were not enough to protect them from the invisible bacteria. They fell in the midst of their work, swept away with the same tide of corpses they had once counted. Perhaps for this very reason, their image became even more haunting. They were both bearers of knowledge and helpless witnesses to destruction. Today, when we look back at the old records, we see that utter helplessness clearly. They could not save people, but they left behind a fearsome legacy for posterity pages documenting symptoms, death tolls, and a medical symbol with the face of death. The image of the bird beak mask, part superstition, part science, is a mirror reflecting the darkest period of European history, a time when humanity writhed in disease and could only tremble while awaiting its fate. And from that darkness, a chilling question still echoes. Were the plague doctors brave heroes who faced death, or were they just walking corpses carrying the futile beliefs of a dying continent? The plague did not just decimate the human body, it suffocated the soul of an entire continent. As death crept into every house and every street, the entire social order was torn apart. From the nobleman in his castle to the peasant in the countryside, anyone could fall within days. No laws, no beliefs were strong enough to shield against death. Once prosperous cities quickly turned into massive graveyards. Bodies piled up on the streets, and the stench of death was so thick that no bundle of herbs could mask it. The church, once a spiritual refuge, now became a place for stacking corpses and echoing desperate prayers. But even God was silent. Priests fell, monks became infected, and the hands that once gave blessings now trembled with high fever and festering buboes. The masses began to wonder if those closest to God could not be saved, then who could escape? In this chaos, the image of the plague doctor etched itself even deeper into the collective psyche. They walked the streets with their emotionless, bird-beak faces, acting as both escorts and messengers of death. People whispered, "When the doctor appears, hope is gone." Instead of bringing salvation, they became a symbol of helplessness. And that very fact has sown debates that have lasted for centuries. Were they heroes or just useless, wandering shadows? The fear of the plague also pushed society to the brink of madness. In some places, mobs believed that Jewish people had poisoned the wells, leading to entire communities being massacred out of paranoia. Elsewhere, processions of flagellants whipped their own bloody bodies, believing that their pain would appease the wrath of God. Faith, reason, humanity all rotted away along with the heavy stench of death. And yet in that darkness, there were still small glimmers of light. The records of the plague doctors, though cold and cruel, left clues about the disease for future generations. It was from this helplessness that later generations began to ask questions. Why are we dying in such numbers? What is this invisible monster? These questions, though they had no immediate answers, planted the seeds for the birth of modern medicine. And perhaps the greatest legacy left by the plague was the change in how people viewed life itself. From the dark horror, they learned that knowledge cannot be replaced by prayers or a bird-beak mask. But at that time in that century, all they had was trembling confusion and a relentless obsession. Tomorrow, will I still be able to breathe today? When we look back at the images of plague doctors with their bizarre bird-beak masks, we can see them as both a comical symbol of naivety and a haunting nightmare. It reminds us that there was a time when an entire continent knelt before an invisible, helpless, and blind enemy, clinging only to the scent of herbs and prayers. The modern world is different. We have vaccines, antibiotics, hospitals, and medical teams equipped with science. But if we recall the early days of the recent pandemic, when people fought over face masks, looked at each other with fear as sources of infection, and despaired at the rising daily death tolls, we realize that feeling of helplessness has never completely disappeared. It is still within us, just waiting to be awakened by a new epidemic. The bird-beak mask, therefore, is not just a bizarre relic of history. It is a reminder of human fragility, that sometimes all our technology and beliefs can crumble in an instant. The question is, if another day, a new Black Death were to strike, would we be as helpless as our ancestors, or would we be wise enough to face it? Thank you for watching. If you found this story chilling and want to explore other mysteries of history, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss our next journeys. And let me know if you lived in the 14th century, would you dare to look that bird beak face straight on?